And finally, there's no provision for returning any of the surplus to taxpayers. What you need is an effective tax and spending limit, and we have a lot of experience with what makes a tax and spending limit effective. You may recall that the first tax and spending limit was introduced in California by Ronald Reagan, and Reagan and Friedman traveled the state of California to try to enact an effective tax and spending limit. They failed, but later California did enact the Gann Amendment, which was the first effective tax and spending limit in the country. And other states like Colorado followed. 31 states have enacted tax and spending limits, and some of these have been effective at various points in time. This is what an effective tax and spending limit requires. First of all, it's constitutional, not statutory. If you put it in the Constitution, your legislature has to pay attention to that. They can't just choose to throw it out this year or use it next year. Secondly, that tax and spending limit has to apply to total spending, total expenditures, not just general fund spending. You want the most comprehensive limit possible. Then you're going to get control of spending. Thirdly, it should be linked to inflation and population growth. That will impose an effective constraint on the growth of government. It means that real economic growth is going to happen in the private sector, and that's the way to get the private sector growing more rapidly than the public sector. Fourthly, you have to, when you run a surplus, if you set some of that surplus aside in an emergency fund, in a rainy day fund to stabilize the budget over the business cycle, and put a reasonable cap on those funds, additional surplus over that should be returned to taxpayers. You need to get the money back to taxpayers whenever you run that kind of a surplus. And finally, I think the most important provision of any tax and spending limit is voter approval. If any jurisdiction in Montana wants to raise taxes, they should ask voters. They should have voter approval. If the state wants to exceed the limit, they should ask voters. Now, we've had this type of limit in place in Colorado since 1992. And the results are very clear. Prior to 1992, government grew more rapidly than the private sector. After 1992, government grew less rapidly than the private sector. And Colorado created one of the best business tax climates in the country. We had the second highest rate of economic growth in the 1990s. We were hit hard by the recession. We're now growing, again, more rapidly than most other states. Finally, what an effective tax and spending limit does. Once you get control of your budget, once you get control of spending, now you're in a position to enact fundamental reforms in your spending programs and also in your tax programs. And let me tell you what we did in Colorado. I helped to design our flat rate income tax. Prior to 1987, Colorado had an income tax very similar to yours. High marginal rates, graduated rate structure, and government grew more rapidly than the private sector. What we introduced, we cut our income tax rate in half, and we adopted a low flat rate income tax. We went from 8% to 5%, and more recently we've cut it to 4.5%. We cut our income tax rate in half. That would be the single most important thing that Montana could do to promote economic growth in this state. Cut your income tax rate in half, from 7% to 4%, 3.5%, somewhere in there. And let me tell you, you can do that if you pursue what we did, which is a supply side, a Reagan-type tax reform. When you cut that top rate, broaden the base, close the loopholes, eliminate all the deductions and stuff that wealthy people and people are able to take advantage of. Close those loopholes, broaden the base, and at the same time introduce a generous standard deduction and personal exemption and take the lowest income people off the tax rolls. In Colorado, if you earn less than $10,000, you have zero state income tax liability. A low flat rate, a broad base, generous standard deduction, personal exemption. Now this is very difficult, particularly to convince legislators. That is a more progressive tax than what your tax is today. By that I mean, what I discovered is we actually, the higher income taxpayers actually ended up paying a larger share of the total tax burden when you introduce that type of tax reform. And for good reason. There's more incentive. When you cut your income tax rate in half, there's a lot more incentive for people to invest, to work, to generate income, to establish their residency in your state rather than in Florida or some other state that has no income tax. I guarantee you, you'll see that the tax rolls increase, you'll see your tax revenue increase, especially the taxes paid by the highest income group. So let me conclude by saying there are three things that Montana needs to do. A flat rate income tax, you need an effective tax and spending limit, and you need priority budgeting. If you do those three things, you're going to create a competitive state, and you're going to make this state grow much more rapidly than it's growing today. So let me stop there and see if, Jonathan, you want to come up and we can field questions if they're...
You touched on a flat rate income tax as being the preference over a sales tax, and I wonder why, because last month I drove through Wyoming and I hated that sales tax so bad. But the thing that occurred to me is that that's the cost of government every single day on every single purchase by every single person who spends money in the state of Wyoming. And I thought that it was quite ironic that as much as I hate all tax, and I hate sales tax mostly, it's because that keeps it so transparent as the cost of government daily by everybody that is there. It meets a constitutional requirement. And the other question is why stop at a flat rate income tax, and why not have a flat rate property tax also? After all, what does maybe your house do for you any differently than my house does for me, especially when it's rated on a value system, on a currency system that raises up and down, and the taxes don't raise up and down proportionate to the currency system?
Well, first of all, let me say I support the idea of a sales tax as a replacement for the income tax. One can make a strong case for that, but my advocacy for a low flat rate income tax is a more pragmatic one. For a state like Montana, I think you're a little like Colorado. I know that you can do this. I know you can cut your income tax rate in half because I've done it in Colorado. I think replacing your income tax with a sales tax would be a much more formidable political task. But I know you can get a flat rate income tax. You could do it next year. Property tax, I disagree with you. I don't think I want to shift the burden to property taxes, but that's sort of a different story. But I would argue that in Colorado's situation right now, you could put a bill in next year that would replace your graduated income tax, get that 7% down to 3.5%, broaden the base. You could do it. I know you can do it.
One other question. If you take the first $10,000 income off the tax rolls, wouldn't it be also prudent as a sales point to take the first $10,000 of income for everybody, make that the zero base?
Yeah. So
everything up to $10,000, and then anything over that would be taxed on a graduated system on a flat rate.
In effect, that's what a generous standard deduction and personal exemption does. For a family of four, that's in fact what happens.
If I could add on to that quickly, I think it's a pretty pragmatic step, as Barry said, to make it a flat rate income tax here in Montana, as I think it could be done very easily. As if I'm not mistaken, the top income tax rate kicks in at a very low level of $14,000 or $15,000 here in Montana, so it could be done very easily with little cost. You could also, getting back to the point of flat income tax versus sales tax, if you're an income tax state, have a flat income tax, but we certainly see the benefits of doing without an income tax, as I highlighted earlier.
One thing on this voter approval, I think one of the problems we have in Montana is that these special elections, we see this in schools all the time. If you go to voter approval, you're almost going to have to require that all elections have to be held in either